Welcome to Stay Home, Stay Focused. I'm Jack Moline. I am president of Interfaith Alliance, and my very, very special guest today is Mayor Pete Buttigieg, recently retired as mayor of South Bend, Indiana. He is the head of the Win the Era PAC, and as you may have heard, he was a candidate for president of the United States. Mayor Pete, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you. It's a treat to be with you.
I want to ask you what I ask each of my guests at the top of these conversations. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, like everybody adjusting to this new reality of ours, but thankfully Chasten and I are both healthy and our families are too. And, for us, after a lot of time really hurting for any time at home or time together in the course of the presidential campaign, we're mindful of the blessings of being able to be home, even as I'm finding it's remarkable how busy you can make yourself without actually going anywhere.
And you were telling me that your dogs are also glad to have you back and will likely be unhappy when this ends.
Buddy and Truman, judging by the way they behave when one of us even leaves the house to make a grocery run or take a walk, they are. I'm not sure how they're going to do when things return to whatever the next normal is going to be, but they're definitely glad to have us back.
So when all of this is pressing down on you, the washing the hands and the keeping each other safe, what is it that helps you restore your focus?
For me, I find that there's a lot of salvation in routine. I know this doesn't work for everybody, but for me, just trying to invent a little bit of structure that wouldn't be there otherwise. Things like pretty jealously guarding the difference between weekdays and weekends in a way that I always aspired to do in the past, but was rarely actually possible. Has really made a difference to my ability just to have a sense that there is a time for reading and a time for writing and a time for calling people on the phone and a time for not doing any of those things. And so I try to find, maybe routine's not the right word, but certainly rhythm in the days and in the weeks. And I found that's helped make it possible. The first couple of weeks, I think we were all just sort of blinking into the sunlight, trying to figure out what this meant and how long it was going to last. Now that we know a little more about what it means and a little more about how long it's going to last, I've found that equipping myself just with that kind of daily predictability makes a big difference.
It's good advice for everybody, and it has sort of a biblical rhythm in there too. Mm-hmm. Since you ended your term as mayor of South Bend and you were no longer pursuing the highest office in the land, you've started this PAC, Win the Era. I have to admit that when I saw it, I thought you were advocating for the Equal Rights Amendment, but that's not what this PAC is, right? Tell me a little bit about it.
Yeah, for the record, I passionately support the Equal Rights Amendment, but this was about an idea that was important to me, certainly during the time I was a candidate, that what's at stake in an election, especially in these times, is not just who's going to be in an office for 4 or 8 years or which party wins, but really what the next period in the life of our country is going to look like. I believed that in 2019. I really believe that now that we know what we're facing in 2020, that the decisions that are about to be made by policymakers in the next couple of years, and certainly across the 2020s, I think are going to decide what our political and cultural and social and economic arrangements are going to look like really for the next 50 or more years. We just happen to live at one of those hinge points that is very stressful and full of anguish at the time, but also will be remembered, I think, as being decisive. A friend of mine joked that living in this moment with this chaos might be us being punished in some cosmic way for ever telling our parents that we envied them for living in the 60s. And I think we're just in one of those moments where what's at stake is going to really telescope into the future. So that was why in my speeches I always talked about winning the era, and that's why that was the name for this effort. So in addition to remaining involved in the presidential campaign, even though I'm not on the list now to be the nominee, I also think it's very important to be paying attention to other races too. I believe there's a paradox going on right now. On one hand, we have never seen such remarkable examples of the importance of offices that don't get a lot of attention, the importance of for example, county officials and state officials who, in American democracy, for better or worse, are the ones who run elections. The fact that mayors and governors, especially in the face of what I regard as a horribly costly failure of leadership at the federal level, those mayors and governors have stepped up to deliver. And of course, as somebody who cut my teeth in the unglamorous, sometimes spaces of municipal government, I'm a big believer in the power of offices that don't get as much attention. The paradox is, while we're seeing more than ever how important they are, there's less attention and resources available than ever. Because to the extent I think that the American people can handle making room in our attention span for any election, there's just one that we're paying attention to. And again, that's an all-important race. But we can't treat the presidency like the only office that matters. And so the idea of Win the Era is to make sure we're supporting efforts that look at some of those other races too. And I think it's a great way to practice what I was always preaching, even when I was a presidential candidate, saying that we couldn't just think about the presidency.
I have a friend who served in Congress and then with President Obama, who decided he was going to leave the federal government and run for mayor of Chicago. And when I asked him about it, he said to me, "You touch more lives in a city than you do anywhere else." And I think that was a great observation. Among the excitement that was generated by your campaign, Mayor Pete, was your willingness to talk about faith and to talk about it as a motivator, not as a campaign issue. Why did you do that?
Well, at the outset, I didn't realize that this was going to be seen as a hallmark of our campaign. I was just trying to be transparent about my own formation. And I felt that faith had been sometimes reduced, almost that God had been shrunken in the minds of some into this political corner, as though God belonged to a political party, as though faith required of you that you line up in a certain way. And I certainly feel that a lot of the commitments that I have as a matter of faith are deeply political. They have a lot of implications for the choices we make. But first, I just wanted to explain how I was formed. And I thought it was important to be transparent about that. I tread carefully on this because I know why there's an allergy, especially in my party, to talking about faith. A careful and I think well-founded desire to make sure we are attentive to the separation of church and state. The awareness, and this is certainly part of the LGBTQ community that I belong to, of the harm done when somebody is expected to live according to somebody else's interpretation of their own religion. So I understand all of those reasons why we've been allergic to talking about this, but having seen faith used as a cudgel in so many ways, and having felt called in my own understanding of how the world works and what's responsible or what we're responsible for, having felt called to pay attention to the least among us and the call to measure our worth in many ways based on what we have to offer to those who are most marginalized. I thought it was important to explain where that came from, and somewhat to my surprise, it wound up resonating in such a way that it was, I would say, one of the top 2 or 3 things when I was shaking hands on a rope line after an event, large or small. Always one of the top things that somebody would come up and say that they appreciated us giving voice to.
Early on in your campaign, as you were sort of feeling your way into this unexpected attribute, you made an evaluative statement about the faith of our current president, which we at Interfaith Alliance objected to in terms of a public statement by a political candidate. We sent you a letter. I imagine you didn't see it. But I want to tell you that we got such blowback from our constituency about criticizing you about that. I wonder if you can unpack the critique that we received for doing that, the response to criticizing you for being so forthright.
Well, I think, first of all, I understand why there's a lot of concern about any situation in which somebody is even tiptoeing near discussing the faith or faithfulness of another. And I'm mindful also that the Christian tradition that I belong to and imperfectly adhere to has a little bit to say about pointing out the speck in your brother's eye, which unfortunately is a really big part of politics and campaigning.
Yep.
but I also felt like it was important to assert the the warping that had happened in terms of just the space between the ways in which religion was being used by certainly by this president and some of his followers, and what not just his espoused or ostensible faith, but any faith might ask of us. And frankly, I saw again just in the last few days what I took to be a pandering look. I think all of us are eager to be in our communities of faith in physical gathering when it can be safely done. But what I took to be a very political maneuver by the president, claiming that he had the power to order all of the churches and houses of faith back open. And then when the sun came up on Sunday, as far as anybody can tell, there's no evidence of him going anywhere but the golf course.
Right.
I do think that this needs to be discussed, that there has to be some relationship between who somebody is and what somebody says. And if that brings us into turf that is problematic, I welcome that conversation, because I think we do ethically need to hold each other accountable for how we treat each other, even if, or especially if, we're talking about presidential candidates. But I also think there has to be somebody's got to call the question, and I wasn't sure who else was going to do it.
Well, I have to say it's a terrific response, and we learned a lot from that, to listen not just to what was being said, but the context in which it was being presented. So thanks for being a lightning rod for us. I want to ask you a little bit about being a gay man. And I honestly, Mayor Pete, looked for an analogy, and every analogy that I could find was imperfect. So you'll forgive me if this seems a sort of ineloquent way to ask the question. I've been active in advocating for rights for people who have disabilities. I've been active in advocating for racial equity and equality. And the question that comes up constantly in discussing these unique attributes of the constituency we're serving is whether the characteristic is irrelevant or essential in viewing somebody as a full human being. Is it important for us to notice that you're gay, or is it important for us to notice that we shouldn't notice that you're gay?
It's a question that I've wrangled with a lot too, because I think, in many ways it was especially affirming of the progress that has been made, although there's a long way to go, in equality, that a lot of coverage and a lot of discussion of my candidacy barely even mentioned or didn't mention that dimension of my identity. And on the other hand, I think it was important to many of my supporters, and it's important to me, that it be noticed that this was something that not only would I have been the first out president, but really in terms of an elected official, was the first to make the attempt, and that this represented a step forward in a very long road that has me benefiting from paths that were carved by so many others, and also mindful of how much longer that road is, especially for many very marginalized parts of the same big LGBTQ plus family whose lived experience is very different from mine. When we think about the violence against Black trans women, we are linked in one way and have radically different life experiences in so many other ways, and yet it's precisely for that reason that I know we need to stand together. And so the approach that I tried to take to this was to neither hide in any way from the importance of this part of who I am, nor to allow it to define us. In the same way that, when Chasten first kind of came on the scene here in South Bend, it was the first gentleman, certainly the first same-sex first gentleman that the city had ever seen. That, difficult, informal, unofficial, unwritten role that the spouse of the mayor plays. Our approach, we decided, was simply to conduct ourselves like any other couple. We felt like any other couple, and went through so many of the same challenges and blessings that couples do, and basically invite people to treat us accordingly. So I don't think there is an answer to. I don't think it's as simple as trying to not see it. But I do think that so much depends on being able to bring ourselves to a place where it's not any more defining than somebody would want it to be. And maybe that's what being gay has in common with other parallel, but of course different forms of difference when it comes to identity.
Well, thank you for being willing to answer that question as awkwardly as it might have been posed. Let me ask you a slightly less awkward question, I hope, and that is about your military service. This is not a destination of choice for a lot of folks who have other opportunities. Can you make the case for people choosing a period of service to this nation in the military or in some other form?
Well, the biggest thing I would say is that we need more shared experiences. And one thing that you can get in the military, and one of the reasons I believe very strongly in creating more opportunities for voluntary or civilian national service too, is the experience of working on something hard with other people. I think nothing bonds you more closely to others than doing something together under challenging conditions. And the thing about the military is it brings people together who may have nothing in common besides the simple fact of being American. And I had to form not just working relationships, but relationships of deep trust with people who were radically different from me, different racially, different parts of the country, different generations, definitely different politics, and learn to trust one another with our lives. And at a moment when we have actually less and less shared experience, less and less from the fact that we don't all watch the same network news at the end of the day, to the fact that there's more and more kind of social and social media stratification. I think anything that helps you cut across that is really meaningful and formative. In addition to the simple fact that I believe for all of our faults and challenges, many of them on display right now, I believe in the American project. And one of the ways to serve it is to help secure it. And if that isn't for everybody, then again, so many other forms of service are out there. And I hope that as a nation, especially figuring out how to do things like scale up the number of people we're going to need for effective contact tracing, just to take one example, I hope we don't miss the opportunity to call more people into service, because it can make a difference to not just the individuals involved, not just those who benefit from the service itself, but I think to the very social fabric of this country.
So you're looking at a more distant horizon than I am at my age. What is going to bring us together on a day-to-day basis, not just in service to the country, as this pandemic begins to dissipate, but not disappear?
Well, I think it's going to be a combination of the pressure of the circumstances we're in and some sense of hope that we can get to a better place. I don't believe our objective should be to go back to wherever we were a year ago. I don't think it's possible. I don't think it's desirable. We are where we are, including our, frankly, vulnerability and weakness as a country, and the disparate vulnerability and weakness of so many who are already marginalized or oppressed in our society. We're there because of all these fissures that the virus both exposed and exploited in order to spread. The fact that there aren't worker protections meant that more people went in without the benefit of a sick day and were more liable to contract and to spread the virus. Just to take one example of conditions that were wrong anyway, but now we have yet another powerful example of why, and a chance to change them. So I think what's going to have to bring us together is an awareness of what we're trying to get to on the other side. Most of us know what it is we're against. I think we got to make sure we have a deeper sense of what we're for, and actually we have more in common when we look at it that way. I remember moments when I would be on the campaign trail in a place like rural Iowa, one in particular, when I called on somebody and just a split second after I called on him for a question, noticed that he had a Trump hat on. And I thought, well, wish I hadn't done that. He had a question about Social Security. He was worried about where we were headed and may or may not have decided to vote Democrat this time around, but whatever had gotten him to that place that he was in the last election, there was a chance to call him in this election. And I think that there's a chance, without giving an inch on our values or the things that we believe in, to call more people to our side in the service of what we all actually want to get to, which is a better place that has opportunity for everybody and is more inclusive. And look, there will be fights along the way. There will inevitably be fights on the way, especially if there are people unwilling to let go of the privileges and the prerogatives of injustices that we sat on and tolerated for too long. But I have to believe, if any of this is worth doing at all, as a country or as a species advancing, that we can find that common ground in the name of the things that we can and must deliver by way of a better life. And those choices, while they are deeply political, don't always have to be as divisive as they've been up to now.
You make me want to stick around to see what you're going to do with all of this stuff.
Well,
So
unlike in a presidential campaign, I feel a little more like time is on my side, and believe all of us need to be looking to the long view.
I think that's right. Mayor Pete Buttigieg, I cannot thank you enough for being our guest today, and wish you well in the weeks, the months, and the years ahead, and hope that the relationship between you and Interfaith Alliance will only grow and flourish. So thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you for having me, and as an admirer of the work of the Interfaith Alliance, thanks for all the work that you're doing that I think, like so many dimensions of service and advocacy and reflection, has taken on new meaning in these times and is only going to be more important as we go.
Thanks. And to those of you who are viewing and listening, stay home, stay focused.